Hi, good morning from Chicago. I'm Benjamin or Benji de la Peña. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center and the chair of the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in Montreal for this summit, but happy to be here at least to share some ideas virtually. So here's a quick question. What transportation system carries more than 80% of all public transportation trips across the world and yet is completely invisible in global policies? Quick answer, informal transportation. And that 80% is a very rough estimate, and it's probably an undercount because no one counts. What's informal transportation? They come in many forms. They come in two-wheel forms like boda-bodas, ojeks, okadas, motocycles, mototaxis, sioms, etc. They also are called in three-wheel form. They show up in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in India, all across the world, in the Philippines. They also come in four-wheel forms, like the jeepney, the songtol, the matatu, the vanjai, and they even show up in global north cities like New York City with its dollar vans. So informal transportation is a global phenomena, yet it always seems to be treated as a local problem. Emphasis on problem rather than asset. And that's why we formed the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation to draw attention to this massive emergent phenomena that happens all over the world and yet is completely ignored in the way we think about transportation. In fact, the very name itself, right? So it has many weird names. It's defined by what it's not. So sometimes it's called paratransit, but that's confusing for North America because in North America we call transportation for the disabled paratransit. Or it's called informal transportation, but that begs the question, what is formal transportation? India likes to call it intermediate public transportation. The question is intermediate to what? And we've used names like indigenous transportation, artisanal transportation, popular transportation, or pop transport. The absence of a name means that we're not thinking about it enough, and we're only thinking about it in categories that we already know. I like the way Jackie Klopp puts it, right? Popular transport, while strongly present on the street, is often absent from planning policy and projects. She calls it popular transport because it's for the people and it's by the people. How widespread is it in a city like Nairobi where there is no formal, read, municipal bus or rail transportation or extensive transportation? 70% of commuters rely on matatus. But even in cities with formal transportation, like Mexico City, 74% of all public transportation trips are through colectivos. So they exist everywhere unless you actively regulate them out and you had the enforcement to regulate them out. So here's another reason why you need to pay attention to informal transportation. Your city, and we're talking not only about the big cities of the world, but the secondary and tertiary cities, will always grow faster than your ability to plan and to provide formal public transportation. Unlike North America and most of Europe, the rest of the world is still rapidly urbanizing, with Latin America having the highest urbanization rates, but still is urbanizing. And so the cities will always grow faster than your ability to plan and build formal public transportation. So you will have informal transportation. And the numbers are massive, right? In the two-wheelers alone in Tanzania, account grew from 2,000 in 2003 to about 800,000 in 2014. And they generate a lot of money. In Kenya, the estimate was $2.1 billion in revenue. That's $70 million more than Safaricom. This is in the year 2017. And yet the government investment profile is very, very different. This is from the Competition Committee of South Africa. They were looking at public transportation investments over a 3-year period. And if you look at the chart on the left, it talks about the allocation of subsidies. About nearly two-thirds go to rail. And then they looked at use of transportation. So on the left side, you will see about 1% for minibus taxis investment, government investment. If they looked at the usage of transportation, and it was nearly the complete opposite, right? Uh, three fourths of the public used minibus taxis, and only about a third actually used rail. So lots of investment in modes of transportation that not everybody uses. And informal transportation emerges for many, many reasons, and it's layered onto both the history of society and a history of colonialization and ignoring parts of the city, but also policies that prioritize roads and travel of the elite. I like the way Kenda Mutongi talks about the history of the Matatu, for instance, in her book. And it was really because these were areas that were not important to the white settlers, and so they were not served with whatever transportation, public transportation they started setting up. And of course, these areas grew faster, and that gave rise to the Matatu. And pretty much that story is repeated almost everywhere that has some colonial experience or some domination by a different power. What's really fascinating about these things is that they're not just transportation, they really are venues too of self expression and ingenuity. The picture on the left is an award winning Matatu. They have beauty contests for Matatus in Nairobi. The picture on the right is buses in Karachi. There's actually a genre of Pakistani truck art, and this is all kind of this very loud ornamentation. And that same thing happens in chicken buses and colectivos in Latin America. So we formed the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation because we believe they can be powerful engines for economic mobility and creating more sustainable and inclusive cities, but only if you pay attention to them and think about them in the whole and as part of a global system. I like this quote from Shack and Slum Dwellers, and this goes back to the first question, right? They like to say the first stack of inclusion is to be counted. And in many ways, we haven't counted. There are no global counts for informal transportation, and there are very rarely national counts. I funded, when I was working Rockefeller Foundation, the Digital Matatus Map, which was the first ever map of informal transportation anywhere and got put up on Google Maps, and it led to kind of extensions of GTFS. But that was just step one, and there's been a lot of mapping happening around the world, and what that does is it makes visible the invisible. But as we think about digitizing informal transportation, I'm sure you know this quote from Melvin Kranzberg, it might be a good thing. The rest of the panelists will talk about the work they're doing with informal transportation, but I'll leave you with a few takeaways to think about as you think about think about informal transportation and think about digitizing informal transportation. First of all, one of the things we learned, this is with Agile City Partners, as we researched digital data collection across the world for shared mobility and informal transportation, that there was a big difference between Global North and Global South. In the Global North, what happens is a new tech platform emerges, mobility platform, and then they recruit providers into it. And that's basically the TNC Uber model, right? A new service built on a platform. Meanwhile, in the Global South, where there's existing informal transportation, what a tech platform does is it introduces a new relationship between the existing operators and the existing users, therefore giving you more data. It's an imposition. So on the North, it's a critical part of the infrastructure. In the South, it's an imposition. And that has implications on how the system works. I would strongly recommend the research of Rita Quadri, who's looking at how OJEC drivers in Southeast Asia are actually bypassing and using their own technology to circumvent Gojek and the other ride-hail services. And they're using their own platforms. And the same thing is happening, we're seeing in India, where the auto rickshaw drivers have shifted to WhatsApp to get customers. That's so that they can circumvent, right, the platform and the cut that the platform has. So anyway, on to those three lessons. The first question that you have to ask as you digitize and think about digitizing informal transportation is whose goals, right? So this classic story is from James Scott, Seeing Like a City, and he talks about the case of fiscal forestry in 18th century Germany. Germany was starting to modernize, and the government-owned lands, the government-owned forests, they wanted to become more efficient. And so they paid attention to counting the trees, and they cleared all of the underbrush so that it would be easier to get to the trees, and they would plant the trees in straight rows. Well, guess what? The underbrush was actually very critical to the health of the forest. So they started getting taller, straighter trees in the first few years. And then the forest quickly started dying off because the underbrush, the small plants that you didn't think were important, were actually very critical to the ecosystem. So what's the goal as you digitize or think about technology and informal transportation? Second is a question of for whose good, right? So here's the case of the e-Boomi in Karnataka in India, the state of Karnataka. e-Boomi was a World Bank program, is a World Bank program that digitized all of the cadastral maps. That means it's the maps of land holdings across the state. And the whole idea was that you would do this so that you eliminate corruption. And because then the records would be clear. What it did though, because it was digitized and it was in GIS, the local farmers, especially the small farmers, had no access to these maps, the full maps, and they didn't have GIS spatial analysis. Guess who had them? There were real estate brokers in New Jersey, and in the U.S. who were then able to assemble large pieces of land around Bangalore and in many other places in the state, so that they could then buy up the land and build up what they wanted to do. So what it did was it aggregated power and it served it aggregated information and it served the needs of the people who were more powerful. So whose good is it as you think about technology? Third, whose problem are you trying to solve? So Nairobi has had multiple experiences of trying to use electronic fare payment cards. I think they're on their third try now. And it often fails, or it has failed in the past, because the point of view was we're going to do electronic fare payments so that it is easier to see what the revenue is and it's easier to collect taxes. When informal transportation runs on a cash economy, one of the reasons why it has to is because there's corruption, and so you can't be stopped if a policeman is trying to get a bribe out of you. You can't pay them with electronic fare payment cards, and so this didn't work because the problem they were trying to solve was a problem of taxation, and it wasn't the problem of the operators or the problem really of the passengers, or there is some predictability of revenue they wanted to have or fares, but that wasn't the case. So before we apply technology and think about informal transportation and all of the data that we're collecting or plan to collect, think about the problem, think about the relationships, right? Who is going to get more power? And again, who already has power in the system? In informal transportation that has been neglected or ignored, the big danger is that as we digitize, you will magnify those power imbalances and asymmetries. So Daniel Agbiboa wrote a really interesting piece in the Republic just last month, and his suggestion really, I would say that if the first act of inclusion is to be counted, the second act of inclusion is to look closely and look through the eyes of those who you want to be included. And so what would it look like through the eyes of the DANFO operators and drivers if the goal was to make life better for them and their operations better? And what would that do for transportation systems? Lastly, this advice from Rachel Caldicott, of course, is that we've done a lot of harm by collecting a lot of data. We have to be very, very clear of why we're collecting it, and also be very clear about for whose benefit. That's it. I leave you with this plug for subscribing if you want to learn more about our work. gpittransportation.substack.com for our newsletter Pop Transport. I myself write my own. I haven't been writing regularly. Makeshift Mobility, substack.com. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.